He would do. Chapter 11. Of course, fear and doubt must flee when such gentle hosts as August and Bertie take charge of you, and in fact a supper of creamed chicken and beans and sliced nut bread can go a long way toward the devil's discredit. Yet for all the Schultzes' home-cooked benefits, their most nourishing offerings were details. He walked into the yard just before midnight, August said, leaning toward Sweet, whom he'd placed on his right hand. Ricky, their Walker hound, barking his dumb head off. All of a sudden he stops, just his stumpy tail beating against the house. I turn on the porch light, and there's Davy sitting on the steps, and that dog shivering all over him. Oh, we were starved for details. After all, there'd been but the barest crumbs since Davy's escape. We'd no inkling of how he'd traveled, no counting a day or two on Nelson Svedvig's mare. No whisper of where he might have stayed, nothing from which he might draw strength. Without a detail or two, even an imagination as mighty as Swede's begins to atrophy. Memory calcifies. One day you wake up and your brother is a legend, even to you. Tell how he looked, Dad said. Why, same as always, I guess, August said. Just more grown up. He had a clean cut right here under his ear. A shaving cut, it turned out. Having hitched as far as Reddock, David walked into a drugstore and bought soap and a razor, employing them in the restroom of a Shell station close by. Then, collaring up, he stepped north into a quartering wind, meeting, as he told August, not one car on 12 miles of blacktop. He was dressed warm? Dad asked. Why, I guess so, August said, at which Bertie rolled her eyes and made amendment. He was underdressed, she said, wearing an old barn coat. I sewed on some buttons, holed pants, no hat, cotton gloves. And Jeremiah, he was awfully thin. Then he assuredly came to the right place, Dad replied, real comfort in his voice for the first time in many days, for it was good to imagine Davy appearing on the doorstep of those who loved him. No doubt Bertie had inventoried Davy's scarcities, even as she stood at the stove, reheating kielbasa. He had a claze of dirt around his neck, she would tell Dad later, but was pink and clean on his face and ears. He ate, Bertie said, like a polite but famished baby hawk, said thank you, please, but barely chewed. Does he miss us? Sweet asked. Did he say he missed us? Well, now, August said. Like sunshine, Bertie put in. He said it's like having no sun in the sky, Sweet. He misses you that much. I remember thinking that was a funny thing for Davy to say, him not being generally lyrical. Yet Bertie looked so sternly at August, I knew she must be remembering correctly. Sweet teared up and put a hand over her mouth. August, Bertie suggested after a beat, tell about the fellow who gave Davy the ride. What a tasty particular. Thumbing west, Davy had been picked up by a man in an Oldsmobile full of musical instruments. They lay uncased in the back seat, a button accordion, saxophone, tin whistle rolling round in the back window, and more than one trumpet haphazardly swaddled in what appeared to be tattered suit coats. The driver told Davy he was from Wisconsin, heading for Los Angeles, where he would certainly get on television. He said there were actually 3 trumpets, and they were linked together by a machined brace of his own design. By holding them just so, he was able to play all 3 at once. The man's face was grained as an old board, and he had a dark pompadour, ideally groomed even at this hour. He asked Davy for money and offered to stop right there on the highway and play The Bugler's Holiday. If the TV producers in Los Angeles didn't like trumpets, he also had in the trunk an amplifier and a brand new Danelectro guitar on which he could play recognizable pieces of Mozart. Show people, August said in wonder. One more gratifying detail? Sure. Davy, retiring upstairs, had twice laughed in his sleep, a strange thing to hear, said Bertie, who lay wakeful all that night, a boyish laugh drifting down those stairs again. I can't describe the sort of peace this conversation gave me. Davy was practically in the room with us. Every creak of the old house was like his footstep. I believe it was one of those rare nights Dad would have let us stay up late, but August said, You kids can take the west room tonight. And that was it for us. Bedtime. Never mind, we'd both slept on the way. I looked an appeal at Dad, but got no help. Being both guests and children, Swede and I were entirely at the whim of our hosts, who meant nothing but well. Okay, said Swede, very pliably it seemed to me. Why, we'd barely got started. I'm tired, Reuben, she insisted, seeing my look. Then I understood and showed it by giving out a nice overdone stretch and a yawn. Bertie said, Ah, you sweeties, August nodding along indulgently. Only Dad was not taken in. He looked me in the eye. All worn out, huh? I couldn't just look at him and lie, so I shrugged, assuming the guilty appearance of the habitual eavesdropper. What Swede had remembered, and Dad knew it, was a swell architectural feature of that upstairs bedroom, a ventilation grate about a foot square, set into the floor. A curious visitor tucked up in that room could slide from bed and hear every syllable spoken in the kitchen below. Of course, there was the chance the adults might decide to talk off in the parlor, which had soft chairs and a davenport and a huge round-shouldered Zenith radio against the wall, also Bertie's collection of tiny spoons from all 50 states, also a set of Japanese swords August had procured while stationed in the Pacific. But the coffee pot was in the kitchen, and the action pretty much stayed there. Swede said no conversation in any room but the kitchen was worth overhearing anyway, something I guess is still true in much of North Dakota. Boy, that west room was cold, though. Minutes after Dad had tucked us in and listened to us pray and left us under 50 or so quilts, Swede said, "Can you hear what they're saying from here?" "No." We eyed the grate some 8 feet away. Light came up from it and soft voices and coffee smell. Heat was theoretically rising also. It was hard to tell. "We could shove the bed over there," I suggested. "They'd hear." Laughter came up through the grate. Adults always start in with that as soon as the kids are in bed. "Let's just tough it out," Swede said. "Hawkeye and Uncas wouldn't even feel this cold. Huckleberry Finn wouldn't even notice it. Come on." But I already had the covers tucked hood-like around the top of my head. A wind had risen outside and was mourning in the eaves. The curtains were ghosting out from the wall. That's how leaky those old windows were. "Don't tell me you want to go to sleep," Swede said between her teeth. "We'll freeze solid," I told her. "August will come up tomorrow and we'll be down there on the floor dead. We'll be all purple." More laughter from below, quickly subsiding to a more serious tone. Swede said, "I'm going," and slid out and crouched up the gate. I can see her still, arm-wrapped knees, face resolute, lit from below. I thought I'd heard Davy's name. "What is it?" I whispered. "What they say?" She waved at me to shush. You know what? I could see her breath. Finally, I hopped out of bed and yanked off the 2 topmost quilts and heaved them over Swede like a tent and crawled in with her. She grabbed my hand. Hers was so cold it felt papery. "No notion at all," August was saying down in the kitchen. "It was hard to know how to talk." "I'm sure it was," Dad replied. "I'm grateful to you for helping him." Bertie said, "Jeremiah, he doesn't know the trouble he's in. He didn't know who Andreessen was." "What did you tell him?" August said, "We talked to him the best we could. He seemed careless about it, said he hadn't read the papers or heard the radio." There was a long silence in which Bertie got up and poured coffee, and Swede leaned up to my ear and whispered, "Ratfink," in reference to the Fed Andreessen, a word I hadn't heard before. It almost gave me the giggles. Ratfink. It's vulgar, I know it. One of those terms that makes it worthwhile having enemies. "Jeremiah," August said, "was it like the newspaper said, the way Davy shot those boys?" Dad said, "Yes, pretty much as it said. He shot them down. Yes." At these words, a thing happened I can't explain. Think of some small furry animal, say a vole, going right up your spine with its cold little claws. It shook me. Swede put both arms around me, or I'd have gone back to bed. "Just so," August said after waiting a moment. He wanted the story, of course, and why not? Being an old friend of the family doesn't exempt you from curiosity, though Bertie must have thought his mild pry undignified because she said August. Just that, just his name. "You shouldn't have," Dad said. It's true he shouldn't have, Dad said. "It's true he shouldn't have. That jury would have had to convict him." "You didn't see it happen, though," August said. "No, Reuben saw it. I'd trade with him if I could." I didn't understand this right away. Trade what? Poor boy. This from Bertie, speaking of Davy, I figured, out in the weather with his collar turned up. But she meant for me, for Dad said, "You'd be surprised, Bertie. He's been a real grown-up, he and Swede both. They've stood up better than I have," he added. It was hard talk to decipher. What was supposed to happen to you if you were present at a tragedy? Was there some sort of damage? I wasn't sure. The fact is, beyond the occasional scary dream, my chief response to the shootings was a self-centered misery that Davy'd had to go away. I just missed my brother. They talked a while longer, in fact a long while, but most of it went by me. Swede could crouch forever, but my knees weren't made for it. I started thinking about catchers, Earl Batty and so forth, guys who squatted that way 9 innings a day. Also, the cold was creeping in under those blankets, and when I tuned my ears back to the adults, they were talking about wheat. The one detail I missed, which Swede told me about the next day, was that Davy had a toothache. He had eaten his kalbasa all right, but was careful about drinking the cold milk Bertie poured him. It pained a molar right down to the root. Bertie had suggested he stay long enough to see a dentist, an idea he politely turned aside. Then Bertie, her heart emboldened, pressed him to give up outlawry and return home and offer himself up for justice. In such public repentance, she said, lay his best chance for what might yet become a fruitful life. And this, Swede said, brought a great smile to Davy's face. And in that smile the Schultzes saw the truth, that turning himself in would be the very last thing Davy would do in his life, however long it lasted. After relating this, Swede said, Bertie had sounded upset and gone to bed, so I suppose wheat came up soon thereafter. I woke next morning smelling change. No metaphors here. Something was different to my actual nose. The air felt heavy, the quilts too, as blankets fell on camp-out mornings. Rising, I dressed by a closet light, shutting the door mostly to keep the brightness off Swede, who was a tough one to sneak out on, not to mention unforgiving afterward. I've always liked the feeling of being the first one awake in the morning. It makes you daring somehow. I went down to the kitchen and poked around carefully, didn't turn on any lights for fear of rousting August or Dad. Lifting the coffee pot off the stove, I found it half full. There were matches on the wall, and I smouched one. To use a word, Swede herself smouched off Mr. Twain. Scratched it, and lit the gas. It made a lovely blue light in the dark kitchen. In no time the pot was ticking away, and I felt self-sufficient and borderline sneaky. Then August scuffed into the kitchen in his nightshirt. He had an electric candle in his hand, one of those which comes on by itself when you pick it up in the night. Feel better this morning, Rube? He coughed. You coughed some in your sleep. Yes, sir. I didn't mean to wake you. Making coffee? Just heating it. Is that all right? He opened a cupboard and reached down a box of sugar lumps. I opened another and set out 2 cups. Saucers, August said. I got them also. He moved to the table, a strangely discordant sight in that nightshirt of his. He walked always at a slight tilt. He had poor balance, particularly in the dark, since being struck on the ear by a draft horse he'd been shoeing years before. The horse, Mike, hadn't meant harm, but had swung his head round at the very moment August dropped a hoof and stood up. Mike was a Percheron of heroic dimension. His head probably weighed 120 pounds. August recovered quickly. He was no weakling himself, but it is a fact that he tipped over easily thereafter. He said, You smell that this morning? He meant the change I mentioned earlier. I don't know what it is, I admitted. What it smelled like to me was a shovelful of earth, a wet day in spring. It's fog, August said. He put on the electric candle, and we sat there in the dark smelling in the air. August was right. I recognized the smell once he'd identified it. It's a thing about fog, he continued. It doesn't matter when it comes. It smells like April. Bertie was born April 22nd, he confided. Every time it fogs like this, I tell her, Happy birthday, love. On receipt of this intimate remark, I suddenly understood what had been given me. Never before had I been with Dad's best and oldest friend, the beloved August Schultz, without Dad present, nor had I been old enough to appreciate it. Why, it hadn't been long since August referred to me as my little man. Now here we sat together in this dark kitchen, the house asleep, talking about foggy mornings. Coffee hot? It was. August lifted the candle so I could see to pour. He showed me to tip a little coffee from cup to saucer and swirl it around to cool. We baptized a few sugar lumps. Abruptly, August stood. I'm getting dressed. Let's take a ride. The fog lay rich and steamy over the barnyard. It was as warm as manure. You could weigh it in a cupped hand, and it really did smell like April, though I noticed it also smelled like a wet dog. The two are not dissimilar. In the weeks previous, we'd grown used to nights of 20 and 30 degrees below zero, so August's yard that morning was a decent shock. He'd switched on the yard light. It showed fog draped all over everything, hanging over the snow. Why, it's 24 above, August observed. He tacked a thermometer to the corral. He slid the barn door open. Good morning, Laurie. Morning, old Brit. Laurie and Brit, his paint mare and gelding, answered him out of the dark, stomping and chuffing. Though professing not to be the rider of the family, it's true Bertie looked more at home horseback. August loved Laurie and Brit. I have a photo of him standing between the two of them, a hand under each of their chins, a little cap tilting aboard his big bald scalp. It's a good picture. Britt appears a little uninvolved, but Laurie has a look in her eye. August bridled the horses, working in the off light from the bulb outside, whacked out the blankets and smoothed them over their backs, and hoisted up the saddles. A horse is a dusty operation, and I sneezed 5 or 6 times, but my wind seemed okay, and soon August had everything cinched and squared, and Laurie was reaching her nose around to poke August in the face. Horse language for gladness, he told me, because she couldn't wait to get out and stretch in the warm fog. We led the horses out. August had Britt and was already setting foot in the stirrup. Mount from the left, he instructed, doing so himself. Laurie was younger and trickier than Britt, a fact that rattled me. Standing under the yard light, the largest of these animals had become plain. I told of Laurie's bridle, and she was stepping sideways, dragging me around. Will she run? Though I tried to ask this as if a running horse were my preference, August saw it for the chickeny question it was. Let's just walk him down the pasture. She'll behave. Up and grab the horn now. There you go. We set off through the fog side by side. By now a deep blue had worked into the east, and we rode down past the brooder house, the granary, the 2 fat corn cribs, all these rising from the blue fog at the last moment. Laurie champed and shook her head. She wanted to run. She was shivering with it, and abruptly I understood that I was scared of horses. My hands cramped on the reins. How had I not comprehended this before? Why, I could barely see the ground. Suppose Laurie stopped in a hole. She might roll over right on top of me. I'd read where cavalry soldiers had been killed, not by arrows or bullets, but by their own faithful mounts who tripped at a bad time. Think about being crushed by a horse. And what if you lost your hold in a gallop, only to snag a foot in a stirrup? I'd seen that happen to fellows. Sure, it was in the movies, but there was nothing fake about the dust they raised, flopping all over the place, full speed ahead. August said, "A little restless, is she?" "Yes, sir, I think so." "Just say, 'Easy, easy, Laurie.' She likes your voice, I can tell." "Okay." But a horse knows scared when it hears it. My tenuous reassurances sounded anything but easy. I had to heave against those reins just to stay to a walk. We were in the back pasture, which sloped down through spotty timber and became hummocky and ended on the bank of the George River, which we crunched down onto and headed upstream. Though nothing but ice it was good for footing, for the river had frozen hard in the fall, then honeycombed and refroze into a cindery crust. You could no more slip on this stuff than on sandpaper, and it made a satisfactory sound under hoof too. Since it was clear Laurie desired to gallop, August coerced Britt into the lead. You could tell old Britt rued leaving the barn, 24 degrees though it was. No doubt that cold fog was working on him, as it was on me. Fog inquires first at wrists and ankles. I began to wonder, as the light rose, just where we were headed, and how long till we turned back, but August ambled on while the banks of the George grew up knobby and weedy out of the fog. Though it seemed a long ride, I don't suppose we'd been gone half an hour when Britt turned and shouldered up a cut bank to the left, where the clay had slid down and made a gradient off the river, but came out onto the field, which, from its tufted appearance, must have lain fallow some years. August stopped, and I let Laurie step up beside him. "Sun'll be coming up," he said. "Yes, sir. Burn off this fog." Yes, it's lifting already, and it was. Across the field I could see dark buildings, an unlit house, a small barn. Laurie seemed to have settled, to my relief. She stood there by Britt, the two of them nodding and blowing and picking up their feet and settling them down. "Would you guess your dad is on the mend?" August asked, which made me look him straight on. "Oh, he's fine. He's well," I replied. I never saw him so skinny before. I nodded. August's concern bothered me. Why, Dad hadn't coughed in a week. Yes, he was skinny, but he'd never been thick like August. Anyone could see Dad was all right. Did he go to a doctor? Dr. Noakes is a friend of ours, a real good doctor. He's the one who delivered me, I added, which credentialed Noakes as far as I was concerned. August sat aboard Britt, considering this. "Yep," he said, "yep." He turned and looked at the place before us, a place that declined as the sun came up. No, now we could see a boarded window, now a front step of tilt, now a talus pile at the base of the chimney. But smoke did rise from its sooty mouth, and in that swayback barn a cow was asking for breakfast, and as we watched a tremendous turkey came prancing around the house, a big black Tom with something on his mind. "Do you know where we are, Rube?" "I'd been wondering that." I didn't know, but I felt like I should. Your dad grew up here. He pointed at the upstairs window, a tall, narrow one with glass in it. His room was in the attic. I used to ride over and spend a few days with them when the folks could spare me. I sat quiet while we watched the place. I was ashamed not to have recognized it. I'd never seen its backside before, only its face as we drove past on the county road. August said, "It sure looked better when your family had it. Your grandpa was quite a gardener. That shelter belt? He had sweet plums all along the south edge, also raspberries. Your dad and I would cut out the old canes and pile them up. They made a good fire." The shelter belt looked awfully sorry at present. Of course, it was January, just a strip of messy woods, but I could imagine a rich, well-kept raspberry patch down there, and my grandpa, whom I remember only from photographs, stooped in his overalls doing the keeping. The tom turkey was trotting through the yard with his head up and swiveling, looking for something to eat or scare. "Interesting old man," August said, "your grandpa. Kept 3 or 4 beehives back of the plums. Arthritis in his hands. Every week or so in the summer he'd go down to the hives and stir the bees up a little and poke his hands out. Take 4 or 5 stings. The poison loosens up his fingers." "He'd get himself stung on purpose?" "Ask your dad about it." I'll admit my knowledge of my grandparents is scattershot. Grandma was in her 40s when she had Dad. Grandpa was in his 50s, late 50s, which, since Dad married at 25, made them old before my birth. A few details. Grandma was a praying woman who addressed the Lord in King James English. Grandpa preferred not to wear his teeth before photographers. They made him look horsey. It's fair to say that without them, he looked surprised and dismayed, but this was probably closer to the truth. August said, "You getting cold?" "No, I'm all right. It's warming up." "Look at that Tom. What's he up to?" The turkey was stalking, circling the house. He'd come around from the front, careful as a heron, neck horizontal to keep the profile down. Then he'd turn the corner and accelerate along the back of the house. Turn another corner, we'd lose him again for a minute. Under my knees, Lori stamped and blew. I looked eastward and saw at the rim of the sun. A good thing about North Dakota, it has buckets of horizon. The sun comes up and you know it is there. Also, it was making heat, the sun was. I could feel it in my clothes, like March. Suddenly soaked with confidence, I asked, "Mr. Schultz, how long do you think it'll take us to find Davy?" "Hope is like yeast, you know, rising under warmth." August reached down to pat Britt, who got so still he might have been standing dead. You had to admire the strength of that horse. August was no lightweight. "I'm sure you'll find him." "But how long?" "I don't know. Say, look there." The back door of the place had opened and a little boy stood in it, bundled in coats. "That would be Gerald," August informed me. "He's 5 or 6. Gerald was holding something, a big saucepan. He stood in the door, a hand on the knob, head stuck out looking around. I've seen similar poise in rabbits. August said, "There's a batch of kitties out in the barn. Early for them, isn't it? See, he's got some oatmeal in that pan." Still Gerald didn't come out, though he did crane around like everything. The tom turkey now reappeared on tiptoe upside the house. There was a low window on that side, and I swear to you the turkey ducked his head passing it. I heard a quiet wheeze, and it was August chuckling. At this time, Gerald's radar relaxed. Maybe his folks got after him for holding the door open so long, or maybe he just believed the coast was clear, for out he stepped and shut the door. Of course, the turkey zipped around the corner like a guided missile, gurgling with wrath and triumph, Gerald dropping the pan and lunged for safety, squeaking through the door only because the tom was diverted by the oatmeal. Breathless, I looked over at August, who was laughing with his whole body, then back at the house. The turkey danced 3 or 4 little victory circles before the door and settled in to peck at the cereal. You could watch westerns your whole life and not see a more satisfying ambush. Then the door opened again, and out slipped a little black and white collie. Given its size, I still would have bet on the Turk, but no doubt the two of them had some history, for the bird twisted itself to run and actually tripped 2 or 3 times getting away, which had to feel disgraceful, as the fall always does when it cometh after pride. The collie didn't even give chase. It stood by the door, looking at August and me. Gritty little fellow. He did step up and have at the oatmeal, but kept looking at us the while. Probably we ought to ride, August said. He'll be after us next. Dog's name is Rip, he added, as though I might get a charge out of that. We let the horses trot the distance home. Say, a trot is a jostly ride. You've seen an angry person beat his fist on a table? Imagine doing that with your tailbone for 20 minutes or so. Later, Sweet told me about leaning your weight up onto the stirrups and so easing the abuse on the other, but I didn't know to do that, and to be honest, I don't think August was doing it either. He wasn't a smooth rider, but seemed to tilt and joust as much as me. Anyhow, I didn't really mind getting knocked around some. Sweet would be simmering over my sneaking off to ride. The least I could do was come back with a sore tailbone. We got that breakfast, by the way, the one I had been so anxious for, the toast and the hard-boiled eggs and the jam. During it, August winked across at me at least 3 times, and Sweet could hardly look at me. For his part, Dad took prodigious enjoyment from the fact we'd gone riding while the house was asleep, calling me Natty Bumppo, as Davy had liked to, grinning at August, even elbowing Sweet out of her Netley gloom. Normally all this to-dos would have thrilled me, Bumpo-like as I was, but I got distracted watching Dad. August had this much right. Dad was skinny. Remember how shocked I was seeing him bare-chested after his siege in bed? He'd lost all superfluous flesh, and I saw now it had stayed lost. Skinny didn't say it. His very bones seemed loose-joined, and instead of being concerned about this, I'd simply gone and adjusted to it. Once he popped out of bed, I just figured he was his old self, and if he looked a little more gristly than before, why, wasn't gristly what a man wanted anyway? We rode over to the farm, I said, noting that August hadn't offered this information. Yes, Dad said. I expected you would. Did you take the river? Yes, sir. We walked over and trotted back. How did the shelter belt look? I had to be honest, kind of scraggly. Dad nodded. The barn? It's leaning pretty good. There are cows in it, though, at least 1 cow, and some new kitties, I guess. Uh-huh. House? I saw where your room was. I was going to say something about the boarded window and the weathery paint and how the chimney was coming apart, but Dad looked so skinny and thoughtful I decided not to. He didn't say anything else either. Say, Rube, August said after a moment, tell about the turkey.